Dr. Nigh, I have been wanting to get my hands on you for so long to talk about SIBO and to talk about sulfur and sulfite and how this all relates to us feeling better and how we might have a chance to change our diet and really impact our health. So can you kind of take it from the top, because I don't think this is a lot of information that's been out there and discussed as much as it needs to.
So, all right. It's a big story, so I'll try to put it into some kind of coherent narrative here. So, I mean, I should say from the front that my entry into this is not through treatment of SIBO; it's through working with sulfur and this discovery that we had. I work with a nutrition therapist, Maria. We sort of stumbled upon this startling realization, which is that really an amazing amount of the chronic conditions that weren't resolving through other approaches would often have dramatic improvement when we started working with helping their sulfur metabolism. And sulfur metabolism is a little bit complicated, but let me try for a nutshell on this. So sulfur comes in dietarily. Pretty much all sulfur that we have is dietary. And there is a lot of sulfur in the body. But the issue is that dietary sulfur, very little of it comes into us in the form of sulfate, which is what our body has to have. That's kind of the gold of sulfur. So dietary sulfur comes in many other forms that then have to get converted to sulfate. And there are lots of reasons that conversion doesn't happen the way it's supposed to. That can be because of environmental issues, toxicities with heavy metals, or Roundup in particular has a dramatically bad impact on sulfur metabolism. There are dietary issues that have to do with this. There are enzyme issues that come into play, and there are genetic issues that come into play. And any given person might have one or more set of those that are going on. So if sulfur coming in dietarily can't make it through all the steps that it has to get through to get to sulfate, active sulfate, then it gets funneled into some side pathways. And those side pathways generate very large amounts of two important substances. One is hydrogen sulfide, which is a gas. And beyond being just a gas, it's a gasotransmitter. And that's a big deal because in the same way that neurotransmitters have big impacts on our mood and brain function and all that, as a gasotransmitter, hydrogen sulfide, it not only is it a gas that forms in our guts, which has all of those issues related to SIBO, it is also inflammatory to the gut lining and actually breaks down the integrity of the gut lining, leading to leaky gut and all those things. And then it diffuses into the bloodstream and the spinal fluid. And as a gasotransmitter, when it's in excess, it can cause anxiety and brain fog and concentration issues and even panic attacks if there's a lot of it that comes through. So hydrogen sulfide gas has this very wide range of effects on the heart. Mostly it causes a slowed heart rate, or just kind of a irregular heart rate is very common when people have sulfur issues. So that is one of the byproducts of kind of misdirected sulfur metabolism. And the other big byproduct is sulfite. And many people know that they have an issue with sulfite, right? And people say, oh, I can't drink wine, I get a headache right away. So sulfite is very reactive. And a key thing about sulfite is that it activates our sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight stress nervous system. So you can kind of see the picture that's developing here. If we can't get all the way to sulfate, we produce these byproducts, hydrogen sulfide, sulfite, both of which are quite symptomatic. And oddly enough, the symptom picture of those two things matches an enormously wide range of people. So where this ties to SIBO is that one of the three major types of SIBO is the hydrogen sulfide type. And so in my own work, the way I kind of stumbled into this is that people would come in to my clinic and with the diagnosis of SIBO, and they say, I got these gut problems. And I would say, well, I don't really treat SIBO as SIBO, but I treat gut stuff. So maybe we could work on this as a sulfur problem. And it actually would work quite well. So it made sense to me that some percent of what is SIBO is at its root some kind of sulfur imbalance. Now, if we take this a little bit further, I would go out on a limb here, and what I believe, and I think is easy to demonstrate, is that producing hydrogen sulfide and sulfite is an adaptive feature. It's not necessarily a fundamentally pathological feature. Now, it causes symptoms, which is a bummer, but ultimately, our body has to have access to sulfate. Sulfate, most all of our hormones get sulfated, and that's how sulfate gets transported around the body for use. Melatonin in the brain is sulfated, it has to be for it to be functional. All of our connective tissue is densely packed with sulfate. We have to have constant access to sulfate, constant. If we can't get sulfate, there is a way for the body to get it through a back door, and that is through hydrogen sulfide and sulfite, which can be converted to sulfate through sort of this roundabout way. So what I actually think is that the growth of these bacteria, which are called sulfur-fixing bacteria in the gut, can be a way that the body is generating the raw materials that it can use to convert to sulfate when it can't get sulfate through the normal route. So people get bloating and they feel not great, but it just so happens that it is a kind of a brilliant way for the body to get the sulfate that it needs when the channels for that have been clogged. So in my mind, I think that in that understanding of what it is, then if in fact the production of those things is adaptive, then it's not going to work to just kill those bacteria, because the body has to have those bacteria. They got to be there. And I can't tell you how many people have come to me saying that they got treated for SIBO and it worked for a while and then it's back. Well, it's going to be back if the body needs what it is offering. And so it's based on that model that I think if we are simply focused on getting rid of bacteria, we're missing the boat. We have to understand this from the point of view of how can we unclog the metabolism that makes those bacteria unneeded. And I'm speaking to sulfur, but my belief is that this applies to all three kinds of the overgrowth. That we will have a much more effective way of treating this condition when we understand why it's there. So that's a nutshell.
That is a good one. So one of the words that you used about the kind, what was it? It started with a G.
Yeah, gasotransmitter.
Thank you. So what is a gasotransmitter? Because I've never heard that word before.
Yeah, so we commonly think of the neurotransmitters, which are dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine, and those that are active in the brain and they, moods and memories and yada yada. a gasotransmitter functions in the same way, and there are several in the body, well, a handful in the body. Actually, hydrogen sulfide was the third to be recognized. One is carbon monoxide, actually. Another is carbon dioxide, another is nitrate, that function as gasotransmitters, meaning that they're gases, but they also have functional roles in the brain in regulating brain, moods and brain function and all of that.
Okay. And then the big question is, how do we treat that hydrogen sulfide so that it's not just about eradicating the generators of it, but also helping to support the body in that process you've been talking about?
Yeah, so this kind of brings us back to that initial points about the different ways that it can get clogged, that the normal sulfate generation processes get clogged. And so it's kind of through the history and symptoms that you piece together what is the most likely scenario here. When people come in, and this has happened, people come in telling me that they grew up on a golf course and there was spraying happening everywhere. Or I have a patient now who grew up as a kid working in berry fields, picking berries, which she said were sprayed all the time. She knew they were always being sprayed. So those situations, I'm thinking, okay, this is largely some sort of accumulated toxicity issue. And I would predominantly approach it in that way. There are some people, not uncommon, who describe their symptoms and they say, my mom was the same way. Or, yeah, my mom and her mom all had the same thing. Or mom and dad both had gut, whatever. Then I'm thinking, now there may be other things, but I'm thinking genetics are likely coming into play at that point. And so, I commonly have people do the genetic testing and, we plug it into a database and we just look for the SNPs that are the polymorphisms that are playing a role in how the body is going to be able to handle hydrogen sulfide, sulfite, and the other kinds of relevant enzyme or molecules in this whole thing. So, another issue that we come to has to do with nutrients and whether or not there are some specific kinds of nutrients that are just not available. I mean, it doesn't matter how healthy you live your life. If you don't have enough B12, you're not going to feel good. And the same is true with the ability to metabolize sulfate. So if the nutrients that are needed as a constellation are not all present, it's just not going to work. And this is especially true. So as we now are eating diets that are loaded with sulfur, because it used to be things like garlic and kale were seasonal, right? We didn't have this year-round access to everything. But now people are cramming their smoothies full of kale. I'm not saying kale's not healthy. It's just not good if you happen to have a sulfur problem because it's got some active sulfur in it. Garlic has been an astounding discovery how many people will have almost a complete resolution of their symptoms. Now, I'm not speaking specific to SIBO. I'm talking about the wide range of chronic diseases that we see end up related to sulfur. But it's amazing how many people, when they just get garlic out of their diet, they feel vastly better. And which is, I mean, everybody's question is, but I thought garlic was good. I thought that was a good thing. And there are people eating enormous amounts of garlic and enormous amounts of kale and, all of these heavy sulfur foods, or taking lots of lipoic acid or NAC, all these sulfur dense molecules because they're supposed to be healthy. They are, unless you have a sulfur problem. And so it is kind of reducing the intake, speeding the outflow of the sulfur metabolites, and trying to kind of get the body out of its overwhelm of this constant sulfur overload, and then potentially going through the reintroduction process to see which forms of sulfur in particular are the ones that are reactive, because the large majority of people are not reactive to all forms of sulfur. It's just a few that end up being the most reactive, and then it's just about identifying those and getting those out, because that is what helps to then formulate the long-term healthy diet. So, you know, if you find out that you're reactive to garlic, then you got to be mindful of that on a Mediterranean diet. You know, Mediterranean is a great diet, but maybe you can't have garlic in that diet.
What are some other foods that are high in sulfur?
So the main, actually, it's interesting that the primary dietary source of sulfur that we have is through protein. So 2 amino acids, cysteine and methionine, are sulfury amino acids. And so in terms of volume of sulfur coming in, for the large majority of people, meat is the main one. That said, it is very rare. It's not never, but it's rare that we have somebody who is reactive to meat. So if they eliminate it for a while and then they bring it back into their diet, it's not very common that someone has some sort of negative reaction. Now, there have been a few, and when they happen, they're dramatic. And so we always, you know, that's part of our process. But the main culprits are garlic, onions, eggs, kale, broccoli, cabbage, and then there's like the rest of the cruciferous and the alliums. They all have sulfury stuff in them, but the main ones are the one that I listed there. So those are the ones that we have to that we really are paying attention to.
And one of the SIBO treatments is, of course, doing the AllyMed, the allicin. And so does that, it seems like that doesn't bother people as much.
Well, I would say that, my dog's here.
It's okay.
I would say that I don't know, and it could be that, you know, there are the different kinds of SIBO, and maybe those people who don't have a sulfur issue and have SIBO for, you know, it's the hydrogen type or something, they would do fine with allicin. In my own, you know, working with people, I've had a number of people who feel much better when they actually get all of those sulfury supplements out. And these are people who are taking them because they thought they were helping them detox. And they tell me they've been detoxing for like 3 years, feeling miserable. They must be really toxic. And I just say, get off the sulfur. And they're like, oh my God, I feel so much better. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's significant. That's really significant. Are you able to just, like, off the tip of your tongue, say those SNPs that are a problem? So let's say someone has had their DNA done and they have, you know, the pluses and the minuses. Sure. What are the ones that we should be looking for?
Well, I would say, I mean, the letters are not gonna, well, I guess maybe for this audience, they will be familiar. So probably the main one that I would say that if there is a SNP here, it's very likely that it's going to be symptomatic, is in an enzyme called SUOX, sulfite oxidase. So this is an enzyme that converts that sulfite, SO3, to sulfate, SO4. If that enzyme is not working the way it's supposed to, then there's going to be a buildup of sulfite, which is a big deal. And that's especially a big deal for people eating lots of dietary sulfur. It's also a big deal in other ways. So that enzyme is interesting for 2 reasons. One is that its cofactor is this funky little trace mineral called molybdenum. And so if there's not enough molybdenum around, that will clog up that enzyme. Now, that molybdenum can get displaced by things like aluminum or cadmium, or some other heavy metals. And of course, that is also going to bring it to a halt. Another thing that's interesting about SUOX is that it is a heme enzyme, which means that in the same way like hemoglobin, anemia, you know, heme is, you have to have heme available in order to build SUOX, just like all of the phase 1 enzymes, those cytochrome P450 enzymes, those are all heme enzymes. And so if the body is unable to produce heme, then there's a potential that you simply can't generate enough of those phase 1 enzymes for detox, or the SOX enzyme as well. Now, it just so happens that glyphosate interferes with heme synthesis. And so as a toxicity, you could be impacting through exposure to glyphosate, which stores in the body, stores in the bone marrow and other places. But that is another thing that can bring that to a halt. So that's one of the SNPs. Did you have a question about it?
Is glyphosate the Roundup?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's the active ingredient in Roundup.
Okay.
So the SOX enzyme is one that I definitely think is important, even as heterozygous, meaning it's like the plus minus, you got one glitch from one parent and the other parent gave you no glitch. Some other enzymes that I think are relevant here, certainly the CBS enzyme, which is an enzyme that is the link between the methylation pathways and the sulfation pathways. So homocysteine moves via CBS down through the sulfation path. And if that enzyme has a glitch, especially if that one's homozygous at a certain couple of spots, you will have it speeds that enzyme up. And so it will pull lots of homocysteine down the sulfur pathway. And it's quite likely that it will generate excess of those byproducts of hydrogen sulfide and sulfite. Another enzyme that I think is relevant here is called NOS3, which is the endothelial nitric oxide synthase. And this is for a couple of reasons. In the sulfur pathways, not only do you generate those two that I talked about, but you also, meaning hydrogen sulfide, sulfite, but it also generates ammonia. And so ammonia has to get detoxified, and it gets detoxified via the urea cycle, which involves nitric oxide synthase. Now there's another connection here. So if you have glitches in NOS3, which is the gene that codes for that, if you have glitches there, it will slow that enzyme down in a meaningful way, which means that you cannot process ammonia as well. It also means that you're not generating nitric oxide, which has some important roles in the body. And that spot, the urea cycle ties into the methylation cycle at the place where dopamine is produced. And so slowdown in nitric oxide, in NOS3 especially, is potentially going to impact dopamine generation because of, anyway, yeah. So that's another interesting component. And the final thing about NOS3 that I think is probably the most meaningful here. So normally, sulfate is produced in, like we take it in and it's in the gut or in the liver. That's where the majority of the sulfate that our body is trying to produce, that's where it happens. So in this model that I'm talking about, it can't happen there. And so it gets repackaged as hydrogen sulfide sulfite and distributed out to the periphery, meaning out to these cells out here, all through us, to get oxidized directly to sulfate out here, which that can happen, okay? So the SO3 can get turned to SO4 out here instead of it happening in the gut. So that's how those things become the building blocks for the sulfate at the cell level. NOS, that enzyme, the endothelial NOS, is very likely the enzyme that is doing that conversion out here. Now, this is not a standard understanding of what NOS is about. Everybody pretty much believes that NOS is just making nitric oxide, and that's what it's for. But I think a very strong case has been made by, she's at MIT, this researcher, Stephanie Seneff, who has published an article about NOS. And I mean, it seems to me a very strong case that during the nighttime, NOS is making nitric oxide, but during the day, when we have exposure to infrared is changing that enzyme into a sulfate producer. And sulfate and nitrate are, I mean, it's more than we can go into here, but they are very, very interesting in how they have to operate in balance. And NOS is sort of this pivotal place on having the body decide, are we going to make nitrate or are we going to make sulfate? So when there are glitches in the NOS3 gene, it not only impacts that dopamine ammonia stuff, but it also impacts the ability of that enzyme to generate sulfate in the periphery. So it's a long, twisted connection, but trust me. So those, I think, you know, the sulfide oxidase gene, the CBS and NOS3, those are very important ones. You know, there are other kinds of bystander genes that can play into this. You know, in the methylation cycle, there are any number of, you know, MTHFR, of course, everybody knows that one, and there's MTR and MTRR that are all kind of tied in there. And there are some aldehyde dehydrogenase genes. They're all, you know, there's so many different ones that can play in. And I think it's really important that it be understood that these polymorphisms are not causing disease. They are establishing tendencies for how the body does things metabolically. And so whether or not those tendencies play themselves out, that's determined by all kinds of things, by how we eat, how we live and move and think, and all kinds of things have an impact there. So, I mean, I've seen people who are just complete train wreck on their genes, but they are really pretty asymptomatic. They don't really have many problems. So yeah, the genes are, I find them interesting and informative and very helpful. But it's also, you know, I have many people who come in telling me that they have all these health problems because they are heterozygous on MTHFR, for example. Well, so am I. It's not, that doesn't determine the health outcome, nor does CBS or NOS. It's all in the context of everything else. So, yeah.
That's a lot. That's a lot. But that's great because people refer to that and they talk about their genes, or no one's talking about their genes, and we definitely need to have a working relationship with them. Obviously,
yeah, right.
Us, we need to understand them a little bit better. Or it's been very helpful for me, I'll just say.